Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Good evening. My name is Abdullah Al-Marzougi. I'm an economics student in my second year at NYU Abu Dhabi and a member of the 5th cohort of the Sufara'a Cultural Ambassadors Program. Thank you for being with us tonight, and we hope you enjoyed the screening of the docuseries History of the Emirates as much as we did. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to this Q&A panel, and we would like to sincerely thank our guest of honor, Anthony Geffen, NYU Abu Dhabi faculty member and BAFTA and Emmy award-winning filmmaker, for joining us tonight. I would also like to express my appreciation to all of the amazing departments and teams on campus that helped organize this event tonight, including global education, campus life, public affairs, the Sufara'a cultural ambassadors, and a number of other departments on campus. Our mission at Sufara'a is to connect NYU Abu Dhabi to the wider UAE community and offer our students opportunities to explore the Emirati culture. We hope that this collaboration with our partner Image Nation is an opportunity not only for our students, but also for all of our guests tonight to explore the rich history of our nation. Once again, we're delighted to be with you all tonight. And now, please welcome Professor Jonathan Shannon, Associate Dean for Academic Operations and External Relations, visiting Professor of Anthropology, who will be moderating today's discussion.
Assalamu alaikum. Good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us tonight in what is a very special event based on some wonderful screenings of an outstanding documentary series. On behalf of the Division of Arts and Humanities at New York University Abu Dhabi, I extend you a large welcome and a marhaban. I'd like to introduce our panelists for tonight before we open up our discussion. First, the partners that we have, Alma Al-Mubarak, who is the Manager of Public Diplomacy from Image Nation, welcome. My colleagues, Laura Asaf and Aaron Pettigrew from the programs of Arab Crossroads Studies and History at New York University Abu Dhabi, who are specialists in the Middle East and North Africa region, and Laura in particular, specialist on the Emirates and contemporary history, and Aaron much more broadly and more deeply as well, history of the region in particular. I'd like to welcome Eric Staples, who is a professor in the College of Arts and Sciences and Division of Social Sciences at Zayed University, who's a specialist in maritime history and boat building, brings great experience to our conversation tonight. And last but not least, of course, Anthony Geffen, who's one of the leading documentarians in the world, numerous prizes. It would take us the full hour and a half to discuss them all. He's not only a beloved colleague here at NYU Abu Dhabi, teaching a very important J-term on immersive storytelling, but one of the leading figures in immersive storytelling in the public, in multimedia productions. He's a CEO and creative director of Atlantic Productions, and also a fellow at St. Cross College, Oxford, his alma mater as well. So tonight we have this really wonderful panel that also includes another student, Nasser Anwahi, who's a student of Professor Pettigrew, who's from the UAE, and we're extremely happy to have students on board with tonight's discussion because their perspectives are extremely valuable. They're often used to hearing the professors talk, but it's more important for us to learn from them, I would wager. So we've all seen these three wonderful documentaries, Taming the Desert, Mastering the Ocean, and Rise of the Super Cities tonight. All fascinating, all deeply engaging on a number of levels. I would like to focus a little bit on the earlier episodes in addition to the Super Cities one tonight, because I have a lot of colleagues who are very interested in the special technologies that were brought to bear on the research project that informed these documentaries, which was, as we can discuss, a multi-year process. But before that, I'd like to ask Alma if she would be able to address a little bit the impact of this whole project on the Emirates and why they decided to help produce this amazing documentary series. Alma, could you speak to that, please? Because it was illuminating to me, just a sort of a mea culpa. I spent a lot of my time in Syria and Egypt and Morocco, where the image of the UAE is like, okay, khalas, they have all this money from petroleum, there's no history, it's all new stuff, it's superficial. And then I watched this documentary, it's like, I had to take my glasses off. Wait a minute, is that 125,000 years ago, not 125 years ago? A really deep history, a really amazing and complex history, and a very rich history. This must have had a very important impact on the Emiratis who were viewing this. Could you speak to that a little bit, please?
Yes, of course. Thank you, and thank you for inviting to join today. So, you know, when we created the series, we were looking at two angles, which were from a local and regional standpoint. So the local series was created to educate audiences, but also reinforce patriotism and pride in the people of the UAE, nationals and residents alike. Whilst the goal for the international series was to establish the UAE within a global historical narrative that is accessible to international audiences. Now, unfortunately, there are many misconceptions about our nation's history. A lot of people believe that, the UAE's history goes back 49 years following the union. But throughout the documentary, we were able to showcase through the archaeological discoveries how, our history stems all the way back to 125,000 years and reveal an unseen civilization to viewers new to the region. And in the series, we aim to capture the country's remarkable past and amazing present. It was important for us to create this link because, our past was a starting point for where we are today. And there's a quote by the late Sheikh Zayed bin Sultan Al Nahyan, which was an inspirational point for the series. And it quotes, he who does not know his past cannot make the best of his present and future, for it is from the past we learn. And we really built the series around that. We can see how, basic infrastructure, innovation, architectural feats is reflective in our modern day. And I think the beauty of the series is that it appeals to everyone who is curious about our nation, regardless of age, nationality, and background. I don't know if you want me to answer. To me, it sounded like there were two questions. So would you like me to answer the impact?
You continue. Yeah, I mean, the impact one, we can also get Nasser on the line as well to talk about the impact on him or any of the people from his family or his peer group who may have seen it. And we can have a discussion about that. And then we'll turn to some details of the actual documentaries themselves.
Sure. So, when we did the early screenings of the program, many of our Emirati viewers were amazed to learn about this incredible history. Personally, being an Emirati woman, I was amazed to see how, there's some early signs that our ancestral leaders were in fact, it was alluding that they were women, and that really impacted my knowledge of the role of women today in our country. Now, during its premiere phase, the local version, was successfully broadcasted across all UAE channels, which was then followed by, the series being available on VOD platforms and telecom platforms such as Du and Ittisalat, along with, in-flight entertainment with Etihad and Emirates. So it was a real television event. And I think people were really receptive to that. Since it aired last year, it has been one of Imagination's most requested pieces of content to be screened at events like the one we're in today, as well as cultural events across UAE embassies around the world. And when we released the series, there was a huge 360 campaign to engage audiences across the UAE, and that on its own was very challenging because we need to appeal to a wide demographic and make sure that the content is relatable and relevant to them. And I think something that I also would like to highlight, what a lot of people may not be aware of, is that the documentary's release was part of a wider UAE initiative, which was to reintroduce our history narrative. In line with the release, they introduced new history curriculum books to schools nationwide. And in fact, the books were created by our archaeological consultant, Dr. Peter McGee. Now, in conjunction with this, we created a mobile museum that traveled to schools around the UAE and engaged thousands, actually over 60 schools and thousands of students nationwide, which was also a difficult task because, you're engaging with really young children. And the way we were able to do so was by engaging them with VR content and, like a hologram display that featured some of the artifacts featured in the series. And, it was just great to see all walks of life, from nationals to expats, the elder generation to the youth, engaging with the series and taking great pride in what we created.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much. And there's a lot of interesting detail you raised there that we can pursue. But I'd like to talk to Nasser a little bit and ask him, first of all, had you seen these documentaries before? And if so, what were your reactions then or watching them more recently? And how do they make you feel? What's the impact on you and anybody in your peer group who may have experienced them in school or in these events like we're having tonight?
So first of all, I'd like to thank you for having me. That's first. And second of all, I've recently watched the documentary. Like I finished the third episode literally like yesterday. And I would really want to say that the documentary does a really good job with showcasing a historical narrative that isn't necessarily known. And we know that oil is the dominating narrative. It arguably still is the dominating narrative. And I don't want to say that other aspects of history are like peripheral. It's just the fact that oil has been very significant to the region and like how the region grew. But at the same time, the documentary kind of precedes the discovery of oil. It goes beyond unity, the narrative of 1971. It is actually a narrative that even predates the Egyptian civilization, which was, to me, magnificent. The fact that the UAE now is framed as an archaeological wonder, which is an understatement if you look at the first episode. For the lack of better words, I would just say it was amazing to see like how the puzzles would certainly piece together. You would look at traditions and traditions of how environments shaped those traditions and created them, but you would never necessarily know the exact origin or the exact reason, I mean. And through this documentary, you kind of have that holistic view, an overarching narrative that encompasses a history when the Arabian Peninsula was a savanna to a desert, when it was the might of the Bronze Age or something like that. And that to me was beautiful. It was something I wasn't exposed to. And it just shows how accessible history is. We're literally like a country that is going to be 49 years old, shy from 50 years, 1 year shy from 50 years. And it's just the fact that if I go 40 years before this, it wouldn't be familiar to me. And if it went 40 years beyond before my father and mother's generation, it won't be familiar to them. And I could be brave enough to say that I could do that in 10-year increments from how fast the country has progressed. And therefore, it's really important to understand that history is really accessible, whether it's 125,000 years ago or it's just 10 years ago. And this documentary really provides a holistic view of how this is possible.
Very good. Thank you for that commentary. You're absolutely right that I think there are a lot of misunderstandings of the history of the region, of Southern Arabia in general, and that these sorts of documentaries can play a really important role in redressing some of these gaps in our understanding. But it's more than just a documentary. This is actually a form of immersive storytelling and history making. It's not just a recording of history. So Anthony, you must feel proud hearing young Emirati saying that he learned so much and got so much from this, something that his parents and grandparents didn't even have access to because of the hard work you put into it, the years of research and the years of filming and the technologies you brought to bear. And just so people know, and this is something we can talk about, it's not like Anthony showed up with a camera, went around and shot a few images. This is something that was a deeply engaged, historically and archaeologically informed project. So I wonder if you might speak to that a little bit about the production of this and your goals and experiences of doing it.
Okay, what was exciting about this and being involved in this series for 4 years is that, and a little over that actually, was that there wasn't a book, there wasn't anything we could go to that gave us the narrative. So if you think about the task here, we weren't doing the contemporary history. Image Nation wanted us to take, to do the history back to 125,000 years. And I want to say there were two different versions. There's an Arabic version of 5 hours. There's a 3-hour version, which I believe is done incredibly well in 70 countries around the world. So the perceptions around the world were interesting to us too. But anyway, having these two separate series was good because there are different audiences to some degree. But the challenge was that if you look at the incredible success of the UAE, you've got these sort of what I call big cities, which are on the cutting edge, but they're nothing to do with the story. So if we were doing that, we would be fine. If you walk out into the desert, there's nothing there. So I remember when I very first went, I mean, I've done previous work in the region, but when I was sort of assessing this, and I drove around, and I realized there was almost nothing there. I mean, how are we going to make this series with almost nothing there? So then the start of a year's long work with the great experts, historical, archaeological, and some oral history too. There's still oral history that's come through, you know, families as well. So that was a long task of just listening and trying to work out, because don't forget, this isn't a history book. This is a documentary that people need to watch and understand how to work out with the experts, the ingredients, but how then were we going to bring that to the screen? And in the end, we used almost every possible technology that I've used in lots and lots of series previously. We used everything because we needed everything. We needed to use, with the experts, LiDAR and ground penetrating radar. So for example, we could take a place like Jalfar, which is just a sand spit now. But actually, if you use ground penetrating radar and you scan it, suddenly you get a city emerging of 50,000 people. That's almost like the ghost from the past. Or you go to somewhere else like Malaya, and you find a building and you scan it and you work with experts, and you can find that building had one of the very first majlis in it, and we put it back together, and that's over 3,000 years old or whatever. You've got, so bit by bit we started to work out how we were going to bring it alive. The foliage, that's amazing, once you get in it. But it was a long process, because to have a good series of this kind, you've got to grip young people, and as well as older folks as well. So you're looking for narratives that will work for both generations, for all generations. That's quite hard. But we had access to recent finds which were happening. There was another skull that was discovered, I think 7,500 years ago. These remnants suddenly give us clues. I mean, you know this better than anyone. Give us clues to storytelling. And the trick with the series is a very complicated series to put together, because you've got, okay, so you finished a year of work and you've got your 3 hours, but then what's in the 3 hours? How is it going to work? And the challenge was significant, really, in this one, because, as I say, we had deserts, a few stones, a tiny, beautiful, amazing camel. How are we going to use those to bring it alive? And all I would say is the reaction locally. People don't pick a documentary apart by saying, oh, you use very clever CGI, and they just have a narrative that they take on board. Internationally, again, the reaction's been very good, because I think people really had a very limited perception of the UAE. They had the perception since 1971. And what I think is so interesting is that the UAE has such a rich history. To be able to take that rich history to the world is I think very important in understanding the culture. So it was very complicated, but we had, as I say, we had to use every kind of technique, scanning technique, but all of it was done with the amazing experts who are out there in the field, who, as I say, were finding things as we were making the series, and that's what you need. But I also like the fact that we were able to take it onto an Imagination back this to take it onto another world where we scanned Casa Hassan, and we could take you through VR through that amazing fort in different time periods. Or we could make you become an ancient pearl diver, which a lot of kids did in the bus that Amma talked about earlier. Or you could have a trip across the empty quarter. These things, I think, are important now. Storytelling has moved, as we know. A lot of people spend their time on a phone or other things. We've got to find ways of taking that and taking it out. And indeed, there was an app as well for kids, young kids, which is almost like Pokemon Go on the move, but finding ancient characters. All those things. And then, of course, the textbooks at the end of that, which is great. So that changes it. But our job was really to produce something that would grip people in prime time. And I believe, the history is here, but it took a long time to get it right, and a lot of help from experts and other people who we spoke to at every stage of the process. Because it's not known, we wanted to make sure everything was absolutely accurate, obviously.
Absolutely, that's great. I like the fact that you use so much high-tech equipment to do this, from LiDAR and the ground penetrating radar and so forth. And yet what accentuates the storytelling is that the technology is invisible to the viewer. It facilitates the storytelling. It's not the story. And I think that's a fascinating way to think about storytelling today in a digital age. I'm just wondering if Erin Pettigrew has some comments on this, because Erin is an historian. Her work is in a different desert in Mauritania. She teaches a core colloquium here on the desert, and she spends some time in the desert, like me. Here is my backyard, not quite. I'm just wondering, and Erin is also a storyteller herself in terms of how she writes about history. So I'm just wondering what your reactions are to the series as from a historian standpoint, and also how you might understand storytelling maybe perhaps differently after having viewed this, and how this might be a new window for you as an instructor, as a teacher or professor. And any other thoughts you might have. Erin.
Thank you, Jonathan. Right, so as Jonathan mentioned, one of the reasons that I think I was asked to participate tonight is because I teach a course on the desert, which is this interdisciplinary course that does not focus specifically on the Emirates, but more it takes the desert itself as a space in an interdisciplinary way. And both Nasser and Abdullah were actually in the course last spring before we all ended up going online. But we were able, before COVID, to go and spend a night in the desert all together as a class, which is something I always do with my students for that class. So because I'm coming out of a specific literature, which is African studies, and I work specifically in the Sahara, there's a real move there to think about the desert as something other than just a dry, empty barrier. So really contesting the idea of North Africa and then Africa south of the Sahara. And to think about the Sahara itself as a kind of dry ocean that is in fact very dynamic, that is a space of trade, of intellectual production, of agricultural work in oases, and also of massive social inequality, because like in the Arabian Peninsula and the Indian Ocean, the trade in slaves was a part of the history. So the course itself is thinking about what does it mean to think of the desert as a space of innovation and of movement, which I do think that these films get at, as a place with history, as a space that has played a central role in the narratives of the three Abrahamic religions, as a metaphor. And at the end of the class, we end looking at deserts as visions for dystopic futures as well in literature and film. Because of the simple fact that arid lands and limited water are increasingly a reality for many people in the world. And so this is also why I have to say I thought of Nasser joining this discussion, because he's someone who's really invested actually in thinking about these questions specifically for the United Arab Emirates and how his country can confront the challenges of this physical environment and the increasingly difficult challenges. So at some point, maybe Nasser can talk a little bit about his plans post-graduation, because they fit into that. So, I mean, as far as a film like this and teaching, I do try to incorporate documentaries and feature films in my classes, because I think that it allows students to engage in a very visceral way in history and in an environment. In my class, I include a lot of music. We watch significant number of films, and students also read novels. And so I do think of visual culture as a very important way to try to get at these histories. And the film did take us to those archaeological digs and gives us a sense as historians of the primary sources that historians can use to tell these histories.
That's great. I like the fact that this film actually brought to life some of those archaeological sites that are invisible to us because they're covered in sand, and that this is a way of revealing primary historical documents for our use for study, so that this documentary becomes a sort of virtual textbook that we can utilize in our teaching, but also learn from as well. I'm also fascinated by especially in the time of COVID, where we're stuck inside all the time, that VR technology is really coming into its own as a way of bringing people to sites that they cannot access now. We can't take our students to the desert, but we can bring the desert to the students through VR technology. I should point out that there is actually a companion website called historyoftheemirates.com that actually has a number of interesting other elements, including VR tours and so forth. I like the fact that you mentioned the Sahara or deserts as a dry ocean. And as you well know, the historian David Abel-Afia refers to the Sahara as a Mediterranean, as a sort of Mediterranean space between lands. And this notion of it being an ocean is fascinating. That links to the second episode of our series, going from taming the oceans to taming the desert to mastering the oceans. And Eric, in some ways, you are a master of the oceans. You're a maritime historian. You've worked in archaeology and heritage preservation. You've also helped work on a boat building project, a Bronze Age boat, if I'm not mistaken, that was actually sailing across the Indian Ocean. I'm wondering what you might tell us about your reactions as an archaeologist and historian and curator and heritage enthusiast about the second episode of Mastering the Oceans.
Well, thank you very much, by the way, for inviting me here. And I love the thinking of the desert as an ocean. There's quite a few metaphors there. I think what I found really interesting is that in sort of looking at the UAE, the documentary I think the documentary series as a whole does a good job of sort of capturing both the terrestrial base history and archaeology of the UAE, and also talking about you call it maritime-based history and archaeology. And I think one of the challenges has always been the ways in which to sort of conceptualize the merging of the two, the ways in which they are not separate. Conceptions such as literal society, viewing it as a literal society in which perhaps large portions of the population are not actually working or making a living from the sea, or even travel on the sea, but how an oasis farmer can still be using ceramics from around the Western Indian Ocean and sell their goods basically through maritime trade. And sort of the ways in which I found interesting, sort of the first documentary is sort of emphasizing sort of the more land-based, and then the second emphasizing the more maritime-based, and then the third sort of trying to integrate it within sort of a single narrative, which I found very interesting, and which is sort of the difficulty, particularly as a maritime historian such as myself. I'm very focused on the sea and the boats. But I think it is an essential element, particularly that sometimes is not as emphasized. Sort of the national heritage narrative is often the Bedouin, the falcon, the camel, the desert. But pearling and fishing and maritime trade is also what you would call as an essential sort of, I guess, sort of oceanic counterpart to that. And so I found it very interesting, with Ahmed Majid and sort of all the boat building skills. And to me, it was sort of interesting and sort of, because, I sort of teach a history of the UAE over a semester, and to sort of see it all put into 3 hours is a very impressive achievement, Anthony, so congratulations. I also found it fascinating. I never really had thought about it until I was actually involved in making a couple of documentaries myself. The challenges of making pre-modern history, as in pre-20th century history, actually visually interesting or stimulating. You have sort of 20th century sort of raw footage, you have oral histories, but prior to that, there's a lot of, sort of like turning the painting into sort of, an actual painting and all of a sudden then illuminating the fire, or sort of lots of pans and all using the CG, or using animation, sort of all of the tricks, which I never would have noticed until I'd actually been involved. And I was actually rather impressed with sort of the wide variety to talk about, particularly sort of the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, the Islamic period as well. So I found it very, very interesting in sort of the ways in which they tried to merge those, the multiple different narratives and the approaches that people take, the different approaches people take to Emirati history in general.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for those comments. Wonderful. In fact, in some ways, because we know the history of the cities, Dubai and Abu Dhabi, perhaps the earlier episodes are more interesting because they reveal so much more that we didn't know, and it's much more fascinating in that way. Laura Saf, of course, is a specialist on youth culture here in the Gulf. She's a super city specialist to get the alliteration going. Laura, I'm just wondering what your reaction is to any of these documentaries, but especially the last one, the rise of these super cities, in terms of how you understood them as an individual who has extensive experience here, one of the few anthropologists to really work in the Emirates, and as someone who's taught a lot of young Emiratis and worked with a lot of young Emiratis and how they might understand it. Students like Nasser, for example, or Abdullah. What were your reactions to this series?
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you for inviting me to this discussion. So indeed, I work on Abu Dhabi, and in particular on youth migration and urbanity in Abu Dhabi. And I also teach on Gulf urban societies. And in particular, I teach a class where we look at the recent history of the region and the factors that converge to shape today's urban landscapes and societies. So that's why I was interested in watching this movie. And I would even say that for someone like me or for my students in the class, this type of documentary movies are almost as much an object of analysis as a source of data for the class. So my reaction to the movie, I was actually first intrigued by the title, and I think it's interesting to think about how Gulf cities have been called many things. They have been called mushroom cities, referring to the way they have sort of sprung up, or they are perceived as having sprung up from the desert. They have been called hyperbolic cities as a reference to their landscape of skyscrapers and world record buildings. They have been called global cities as a reference to the diversity of their populations and to their role in global economic networks. More recently, they have been labeled by themselves, or they are attempting to become smart cities, referring to the use of technologies in urban planning. And so super cities sort of is one other term in that landscape of appellations or labels that are used for these cities. And it's interesting because it's a title that I think particularly interesting, and here I'm using the sort of analyst cap, in the sense that if you compare it to the title of the other movies, and I would love to hear Anthony say a bit more about how these titles have been decided. But Taming the Desert and Mastering the Sea sort of suggest a hostile nature that needs to be controlled and domesticated. And this perspective, I think, now has changed in official discourses in the UAE, and the notion of super cities also raises another more timely question, which is that of the sustainability of these cities, which I think is an intense preoccupation at the moment. The film itself actually focuses more on the genesis of Abu Dhabi and Dubai, and it discusses some of the factors that gave these cities their current shape. The exploitation of oil, of course, the formation of the Union in 1971 and the political events that led to this formation, but also something that is probably less discussed, which is the historical urban form of the cosmopolitan port cities in the Gulf. And there are three topics here that I'm taking a lot of time, sorry, but there are three topics that I'd like to highlight that are probably going to come back in the discussion. The first one is the urban diversity that is characteristic of Gulf cities, and these cities have been labeled some of the most diverse in the world in terms of linguistic, religious, ethnic plurality. And I think the film touches interestingly on two aspects of this diversity. One of them is the internal diversity of the Emirati population, by mentioning briefly at the beginning the shuhur in Ras Al Khaimah, and also the religious diversity by focusing on the Christian history of the region. And I think there's a glimpse of someone making an offering at a Hindu temple in one of the first images in the movie. And I would love to have seen even more images of this larger diversity of the contemporary cities. The second topic is the question of gender and the role of women in society. And in the movie, I think they're portrayed mainly through their participation in an armed conflict earlier in the history of the UAE, because I guess it's probably the most surprising maybe element in view of the traditional gender roles. But it's also important to underline that there are many other modes of participation in society that have been seized by women through education, through participation in the workforce. And I think some of the female historians that we see in the movie are part of them. And probably also Alma, who introduced the conversation, can be seen as one of these women. And the last topic is urban development. And I think the movie just stops at the moment when these super cities emerge, right? And that probably could become the topic of yet another movie to come. Anthony, if you're interested in doing that. And so I have a question actually for Anthony, which is that the documentary movie, or this last movie, introduces us to a selection of historical events, sites, figures. And I was wondering what drove the decision on which of these historical events and figures to include or not in the movie, and why these choices were made.
Good questions. Thank you, Will, for those comments and questions. Yeah.
That's a very good question. I mean, when you get into the later stages of scripting the films, what you're looking for I suppose, is you're looking for things that you haven't dealt with. So, for example, you know, the Christian element that we look at in one part, we may then say, well, we won't look at it in that part. I was fascinated by the early role of women, you know, in this Malaya, this, you know, queen who clearly ruled that local area, you know. So, you know, we're trying to, you know, obviously we can't balance it in a boring way because otherwise the film wouldn't be interesting. But but we are looking to find things. You can't get everything in, and sometimes you can't deal with something because it doesn't fit. That doesn't mean in any way you're distorting the history. This isn't every element of the history. This is a mosaic, a way of triggering interest and getting a global audience, which if you take all the audience on the National Geographic film, that's a large audience, you know, multiple times. And so you're looking to tell a, you know, yes, an honest, you know, an absolutely accurate narrative, but you have to balance that you can't put everything in there. And that, you know, if you deal with it in the second hour in a particular way, as I'm saying, that, you know, other religious groups, then you probably won't deliver it in the third hour. So it's this juggling match that goes on, and you know, it's hard because you can't get everything in. But I've always said about films, they're narratives, and they have to hold together as narratives, and they often ask more questions and of you that you want to then find out about. So the important thing is not to just cram everything in, but to find these narrative lines that the audience can follow to understand the theme that you've set them. That's why we, you know, set up those particular themes of the land and then the sea and then the cities, so we could deliver on that. You can't deliver on everything, so it's a really, really good question. And you know, there are things you leave out you regret later in some ways, but it doesn't affect the overall narrative of the three programs, if that makes sense. And actually, the best thing ever is to have a book go with the series. Whenever I do my David Attenborough series, we have a book that goes, because then David can put a whole load of stuff in the book that doesn't need to be in the series, because they're, you know, I can't stress enough with the way society is moving, to tell histories is one of the hardest things, because people just, they don't come to it. You know, they don't think it's important. You know, it could be a game about, I don't know, it could be about the Kardashians or something. Everybody will watch it. So we you know, we have to really be clever how we tell the stories here and how they weave, because I wanted this piece of work to be around. You know, we've done with Image Nation, who we work with through the whole thing. I want it to be around for a long period of time. You know, you don't want to go out and remake this series. So I was thinking of digital techniques, and I think Jonathan's absolutely right. If you spot a digital technique that we're doing, and that gets in the way of the story, then we failed. I like to think all our technology is sort of embedded inside the story, and you don't even think about it. Oh, look, the whole desert's coming back to life. You don't think of a computer graphics shot. You just see the desert coming back to life. And that particular thing was pretty extraordinary, because when you've got, you know, people forget that the deserts, you know, were not always deserts, and we're dealing with such a big time span. You want to surprise people in ways like that. So yes, you know, and I'm sure we've talked to Image Nation about doing a book possibly later, but it can't be everything, but it's got to hit buttons and it's got to hit narratives. That's what people now listen to, you know, and particularly in the age of, you know, the 5-minute film or the 4-minute film or the Instagram, we've got to really keep you glued for that hour on each of the hours. And you know, that's what we're paid to do, and I think that's hopefully what we do, and that's why Image Nation brought us in. I was particularly interested because I'm often making historical films or other films about the West, but actually I find you know, histories about places where really even the locals don't know very much about it, far more interesting in a way, because you're having to work harder to get narratives. You know, in British history, we've got thousands of years of well-documented history, and we haven't got photographs of it, but we've got, you know, wall paintings and other things. I quite like this idea that it's a big challenge, you know, and I sometimes think back, as I write a diary, to the day I walked out to the desert and thought, God, how are we going to do this? You know, how can we possibly tell this story? That's the challenge, which 4 years later, you know, you know, working in collaboration with the Image Nation, comes something that has not only, I think, I'm proud of, works, you said this several times, but works locally, but works internationally. Because I think people were very surprised in the United States and other places that to be honest with you, that the UE had this incredible history.
Absolutely. Of course, we all know as scholars, as historians or anthropologists or writers in any form that history or stories are always selective, and how we select them is very telling. to select them in order to trigger interest, as you put it, or to push buttons and push people to think more, I think is a really valuable way of thinking about how this documentary serves to trigger interest for further discussion, further development, whether it's in a companion book series or the website, which again, I tell people they should have a look at it. There are a number of questions that have come up on the Q&A. Some of you have already been addressed. For example, Rashid asked about, documentaries help us to understand our past, but how can we develop them to keep pace with young people's use of social media? I think you mentioned that as well. Keeping interest in a 5-minute or even 5-second culture where people are picking up their phones and the Instagram 1-minute video, or maybe now 2 minutes. But a mother, perhaps more. Yes.
If I just may add to that, because this is sort of our speciality and what we
Absolutely.
do. I think it's a very relevant question, and I think that the way we go about it, and Anthony touched based on that, and I think Anthony, you did a fantastic job in terms of using the best of what technology has to offer, and creating these multiple strands, engaging strands where people can be further educated. So I think, yes, the idea is to create snackable content, but we need to understand that the social media generation, and without being condescending, but they do have sort of like a shorter attention span than maybe our previous generation. So the way you do that is create multiple links, whether it be the app, whether it be short snippets of content available on social media, whether it be the ebook, because I'm not sure if I probably didn't mention this, but we integrated the way we integrated further with the history curriculum was by integrating these links where, in their ebooks, where they can just further to reading the information, they can click on the relevant parts. So I think it's connecting these dots and creating sort of like a 360, with multiple touch points on multiple on cross platforms. And I think that's the way, and that's kind of the paving the way for a future as well.
No, I think right. Although I sort of chip in there and say, I mean, absolutely right, Alma, and that was the great joy of working with Image Nation, who realised the multiple platforms. But I also think we've got to be careful, because if we're not careful, we get into say with a documentary where we have to have car chases in it and things like that. No, we don't. We've forgotten, since the people put the reflected light on their walls, thousands and thousands of years ago, and told stories. The document, I like to see it as a pathway where we start on an Instagram, then we maybe get some VR, but I still want people, and still people will come to the documentary. And I think there's proof now that the Instagram generation will come to a documentary, but we have to, talked about this earlier, we have to entertain them in a way that in no way devalues the story. But I believe we have to work harder, but I think we need to work harder now, because we need to keep people in the 50-minute zone, because if we lose them, they're really going to be, just getting tidbits of history, and then the whole thing becomes a caricature. So I back totally what Alma was saying, this series, and I loved it the way we were able to do it in the round. But I would also say, as storytellers and students out there, you've got to think now, particularly with my immersive storytelling hat on, there are ways in documentaries and longer form immersive stories where we need to keep people, and we need to get them there for 50 minutes or 3 lots of 50 minutes. Because if we lose that culture, it's like we stop reading books. We really have to fight. So I think, my argument is use more and more clever technology that you can't see, but keep the younger generation engaged in something like this. Because otherwise, if all the old folks watch it, that's great. But we need younger people to watch series like this.
Yeah, I had my teenage son watch the 3 episodes with me, and he was, for the most part, engaged. I wouldn't say for the full 50 minutes, but more of it. I mean, the temptation to get the phone out was too great. There are a couple of other questions that are relevant. Yeah,
he was going to Alma's website so that he could see what the content, the image.
I think that's probably what he was doing, no doubt. There are a few other questions that are of historical importance that anybody can feel free to answer, Aaron, Laura, Anthony. I'll just combine them. Building on Professor Pettigrews' discussion of slavery, can anyone speak to the African influences in UAE culture via the pearling industry? Another question is there still a Christian Emirati community, although the religion seems to have died down in the past? not expatriate Christians, but an Emirati Christian, Arab Christian community here. And finally, an earlier question was, there was a lot of emphasis on Sheikh Zayed the first and Sheikh Zayed the founder. How about Sheikh Shakbout, who was not really discussed during the episode? And the participant says, my understanding is that while he was quite conservative with how he utilized the oil wealth, he did invest in the desalination that helped create the conditions for the growth of Abu Dhabi. Can anyone talk more about the role of Sheikh Shakbout, for example? Those are just three of the questions that were put in the forum for tonight. Anyone want to take a stab? Aaron, Anthony, Eric, idea of African influences. Maybe Eric, you want to talk about that in terms of, well, Aaron's teaching a class on actually race and slavery in the region, so you'd be a perfect person to begin the conversation. And maybe Eric can talk about Indian Ocean connections as well.
Sure. I mean, all I would say is that the height of the slave trade from East Africa that went primarily through Zanzibar, but not only, was really in the 19th century. So this is rather late when one thinks about the history of slavery globally. The British had technically abolished slavery, but they weren't very interested in actually enforcing it. And so it continued well into the 20th century. And there are observations from British in what then were what became the Trucial states anyway, that note that 20 to 25% of the population in Abu Dhabi, Dubai, Ras Al Khaimah at the beginning of the 20th century was of African origin and primarily enslaved labor. So this was historically a significant part of the population of people living in the Gulf. And so, of course, there are vestiges of, and of course, you know, the descendants of these enslaved people live in the Emirates today. And maybe, Eric, you can speak more about their contemporary cultural practices that might reflect that history. But I would just say that I think primarily the way that people understand that history, appearing aside from concepts of skin color or understandings of skin color, are certain musical styles and forms and certain dance styles and forms, and also the continued association of certain occupations with people that are understood to have certain skin colors.
Thank you for that excellent response, Aaron. Eric, you have some follow-up thoughts? We'll turn
well,
to
I think Aaron actually covered almost all of it. Excellent answer. I mean, I think obviously slavery is part of the maritime landscape of the Western Indian Ocean and has been for a very long time. It has ebbed and flowed, but there is evidence for, you know, slaves being used on ships as sailors from the medieval period onwards. I guess what you would call the rise in the slave trade in the 19th century that Aaron was referring to, interestingly enough, also coincides remarkably with the pearling boom of sort of, you know, the 1820 to 1914 pearling boom as well. And if you look at the photos, obviously, it's very apparent that there are, you know, as well as, you know, records of African slaves that are taking part in the pearling trade as well. It was a very difficult, I mean, it's slightly romanticized perhaps now, but pearling was one of the more difficult and harsh maritime forms of labor that have been documented. And so it was rather difficult to find people to do it willingly. And so, but what we do see is that there are continued influences, obviously, beside, you know, sort of the ethnic influences that we still see within Emirati society today. But I think Aaron also mentioned, like Dr. Aisha Bakhair at National Archives has done quite a bit of study on what she calls Afro-Emirati culture and Afro-Emirati music in particular. This is not just part of what you would call the UAE in Oman, where I lived for 8 years and done most of my research. Actually, quite a bit of the Omani, the Saudi music traditions has strong African traditions and rhythms, which are found throughout. And so it's, think of it more, I guess, what he was much more porous, and I guess what you would call hybrid series of maritime communities in which Africans, slaved and freed, are an essential part, I would say.
Thank you for that. It's wonderful that you emphasize connections, because that's really what this whole region is about, is connections across the various seas, the dry sea of the desert and the actual wet sea of the Indian Ocean and Persian Arabian Gulf region, to bring peoples together, but sometimes under conditions that we wouldn't recognize today as favorable, including slavery. When my son saw the pearling, the ocean episode, he's like, wow, that was really hard for them. It's like, he thought that pearling just meant like going down and scooping up some oysters and opening them up. It's like, that was really dangerous. I said, yeah, it was dangerous. Nasser, I wonder if you might speak a little bit about the Christian Emirati communities and a sense of Christianity in the UAE today.
So with regards to whether Christianity is still present within the local community, the Emirati community, I have not been acquainted to people who are practicing Christians, but nevertheless, this does not disregard the history of Christianity in the region. And not only the role of Christianity in the region, but also the role of the desert in Christianity as well, when it comes to early monasticism and a lot of other things. But I remember 2 years ago, there was a news article highlighting that Kuwait assigned their first Kuwaiti father of the church. And it was unexpected. However, when you puzzle the piece while looking at the documentary, and you can see that there's a monastery here in Sar Banias, it suddenly makes sense, because usually when you're going to talk about monasteries and temples or something like that, it was something I personally, that is strictly anecdotal, but I personally would attribute to the West. Like if I were going to go visit a monastery, for instance, I'm going to go to a place in Europe probably. But that is not the case. You could see Sar Banias, and I'm sure that with more archaeological findings, you're going to find more evidence that Christianity played a very important and crucial role in the region, and specifically in the UAE as well.
Thank you for that nice response, Nasser. And in fact, I think it's surprising to many people the deep Christian history here in the region. And so that's one thing that's highlighted in this documentary series. Laura, can you speak a little bit about the role of Sheikh Shakbout and the UAE, since that was one of our interesting questions tonight?
Yeah, but first I just wanted to say two things about the previous points. One about the question of African influence, just to point out that it's also an influence that continues today through African migration to the UAE, that is still a continued flow of migration. And about the youth, I wanted to say that I don't think there's actually a lack of interest in history. But there's also actually, or what I see among my students at least, is on the opposite sort of a demand for a history that goes more into details, that goes beyond the staple images that are present everywhere. I'm not saying this as a dismissal of these images, because I think they're important and they also allow a specific living relationship to national symbols, like in the heritage villages, for example. But I also see a demand for another type of historical discourse. And in the class I teach, for example, I had the students work on British diplomatic archives about the Gulf. So some of the letters that some of the people we see in the movie exchange with each other or with the Foreign Office in the UK. And that leads me directly to the question about Sharbut, because some of these diplomatic archives that we looked at were the ones discussing the reign of Sheikh Sharbut. And one thing that is very notable in these British archives is that the British are clearly very displeased with Sharbut, because they want to dig for oil and he wants them to dig for water in Abu Dhabi. Because he is a tribal leader, because what he is preoccupied with is giving potable water to his constituents, which of course makes a lot of sense, but clearly the British are very sort of displeased with him, and they are more interested in developing their economic interests in the region, and so looking for oil. And that sort of builds a specific image of Sharbut in the British archives that is a very sort of dark one. But there were, of course, other aspects of his reign, and the fact that he was equally sort of reciprocally very suspicious of the British influence, probably for legitimate reasons in the region, and ultimately was deposed.
That's great. Thank you for that perspective, Laura. Multiple perspectives on Sheikh Sharbut, and I think we have to be aware of the colonial lens having corrupted much of the worldview of that particular leader. There are a number of other questions that are rising in our Q&A forum here. Some directed toward the Emiratis. I would combine them. Was there any specific narrative history that you think was missing in the documentary series? We've talked a little bit about that. And also from Nada, who's one of our graduates, Question for Laura or Nasser, perhaps. Which elements of Emirati history and culture portrayed in the documentary do you see as present even today amongst contemporary Emiratis and youth in particular? So maybe what was perhaps some stories that were not told, but also stories that continue to have relevance today for, maybe Alma can talk about that, and Nasser.
Sorry, it's cut on my end. Could you just repeat the last question?
So what stories for the Emiratis were left out, you think? Important stories that were not highlighted? We've already talked about this a little bit, but also what are some stories that continue to have relevance for your lives today as Emiratis?
I don't know if I should give an example, but I think that there are many, I don't know how to answer that, because I think every day there's a new story and it's that are relevant. So it's a difficult question to answer from my end.
Okay.
Maybe
Offer, you have some thoughts? Stories that resonate with you today or with some of your friends?
That resonate. Sorry, if we're talking about resonate, I think the stories, the biggest example I can use, which is very relevant to what we're going through today, is the pandemic and how everyone has kind of unified in this time, and the great strides and achievements that the UAE has done to tackle the pandemic. I think this is something that's going to go in our history book. So to me, that's one of the biggest stories.
Great, thank you. Nasser, you have some follow-up comments?
Yeah, as like to the first question, which we already highlighted, I just want to say, like in the third episode, the only thing that that I kind of noticed was the fact that the role of the other Emirates when it came to the unity, like Abu Dhabi was a conditional factor, and but the role of the other Emirates, I would say, was kind of underplayed. Specifically, like if you look at the conditional factors such as Dubai and Sharjah as well. But nevertheless, it was like a holistic view of what happened, I would say. And the second question about what resonates and what is still there, I would say the fact that I would speak from experience, being a person from Dubai. Dubai is still the trading hub that was like 40 or 50 years ago. And talking about my father's story, talking to my father and him narrating stories, and my grandfather narrating stories as well, and my mom as well. It just shows how these things still exist. If you go to Arras right now, or if you go to Old Dubai, you're going to see the same trademarks, the same LLCs. You're going to see the same people right there. And when I said towards the beginning that history is very accessible, it is really accessible. And I just wanted to reiterate what Anthony said, was a lot of it is oral, and we should like kind of put the effort in order to extract those information. And I still believe that it's still present. And yeah, just visit them. If you go and visit them and just ask questions, as I would say, poke the bear, and you're going to get a beautiful response. Although like the analogy wouldn't be great, but like you'll get a beautiful response.
Thanks for that. That's a beautiful response on your of your own. A couple of Anthony, do you have a follow-up on that, or I don't know if you're raising your hand. It's hard to see. There are a couple of other historical questions that have come in. Oh yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
I just wanted to follow up on that. I mean, there's sort of an interesting parallel that struck me when I was making the series. Everybody talks today about, there's been the rise of the pearl industry, then the rise of oil, and I see today Abu Dhabi and Dubai and the other Emirates, going on to new frontiers of medical and tech and other exciting things. But actually, I think that's a trait in a way, if you said the Emiratis. I mean, come back. These are people who got out and they tamed the desert. These are people, in the copper, in the Bronze Age, who were, it was a huge industry. I mean, they were at the center of the world in a way for that moment in time, 7,000 years ago or whatever. And then suddenly, so I think what I think is really interesting when you look at that mentality over a very long period of time, I think it's actually really useful for Emiratis to think that, they're very good at changing and moving into something else. And yet if you were to ask the international community, they say, oh yeah, they were, the oil came about, it partly came about with the Brits, and that's now going. I think they should draw inspiration in some ways from the fact that for generations, people in this area have been on the forefront, literally, of new technology, of, you know, when you were able to extract, you know, copper, you know, for bronze and things like that. That's a long time ago, you know, 5,500 years ago. And I think, I just, you know, looking in from the outside, that's something that's always struck me. And I think people should realize that.
That's an excellent point. You know, necessity is the mother of invention, and the Emiratis have been innovative for many millennia, partly out of necessity, and now because of also contemporary necessities. A couple other questions here. But sorry, I lost my audio there. A couple historical questions in the forum here. I'll combine them. One is, what really accounted for the rise of this region in terms of its trade networks? What accounts for the rise of these trade networks? Was it demand for particular goods like gold, or what other factors contributed to the rise of strong trade networks that would allow Dubai, for example, to rise as this great port city? And another historical question, I'm not sure who can speak to this one, is that Kuwait and Iraq have very long and distinguished Jewish histories as well, as does Iran. Was there a Jewish history in the Emirates? And we've talked about the Christian history. And if so, can anybody speak about the Jewish history or the history of Jews in the UAE or in the Arabian Peninsula? So one question on the rise of trade networks and what pushed that, and then maybe another question on diverse community or religious communities in the UAE.
I guess I'll give a stab at development of trade networks, largely because, you know, I look at it from very maritime lens, and so I look at so much of the importance of the region, although it's obviously only one part of it. I think you see, you know, as Anthony was alluding to, that there's not a single reason for the development of trade networks. What we see are there's some what you would call structural longue durée ecological reasons, sort of lack of natural resources that requires, you know, a wide variety of goods and grains and timber and all the rest of it to be obtained from more tropical or subtropical zones such as in India and East Africa. But in exchange for that, which usually is one of the reasons why these maritime technologies were developing, said, you also see different goods becoming more relevant at certain times. You know, Anthony mentioned the Bronze Age, obviously, when bronze is 90%, bronze is 90% copper. And it was ideally located, you see the sort of fluorescence in that 2400 to 2000 BC, when you have the rise of the Meluhha civilization in Mesopotamia, and it's sort of ideally located in between. And then you see sort of the fading and the rise of Delmun. But in the Islamic period, you also see this, I guess, what you would call the development of, I mean, it's essentializing to call it sort of Islamic maritime networks, but there are a pronounced Islamic dimension, particularly in the Middle Islamic period, where you see the rise of Julfar, particularly the rise of horse trade, as it becomes integrated into the Hormuzi trading empire. You have sort of also the, I guess, almost structural nature of the pearl trade, you know, first evidence for it 7,000 years ago. But we see consistent references, you know, from the written sources for at least 2,300 years. So there's sort of certain goods, and then you combine that with dates that rise and fall, dried fish that rise and fall. So you have all of these different components that sort of collectively make it an important part of a much larger trade network that can expand all the way to the Indo-Pacific, it's often called, into China, or recede into a much more regional Gulf, depending on the time period.
Great, thank you for that, Eric. Excellent perspective on the sort of early histories of trade. I'm losing my audio here for some reason. Laura, would you like to add something on trade networks and possibly anything else you'd like to talk about for the UAE?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to what Eric just said, that one aspect of the importance of the Arabian Peninsula in trade networks is also its geographical location. at the crossroad between many continents that represented sort of the offer and demand of many of these goods. And one thing to note as well that made the success of these port cities, and here I'm thinking particularly of the rise of Dubai as a port city in the beginning of the 20th century, besides the pearl trade, was the fact that around these cities on the Gulf Coast, there were merchant communities that tended to move from one city to another according to the mode of taxation that the ruling elites of these cities were imposing on them, etc. And so the thing that Dubai did and at the time, the other shore of the Gulf was sort of represented the most affluent port. But when Iran started its national construction and sort of started adding taxes to the goods that were traded through its ports, Dubai had decided to have this policy of no taxing, and so became a hub in large part for this reason. So Dubai owes this prosperity to its free zone aspect. Let's say that started very early on in the modern history of the city.
Great, thank you for that question. Here's a fun question for Anthony. It says that the year is 2120. What would a documentary about the UAE look like?
Gosh, that's a really that's a hard question. But I mean, if we're looking back, we've already done a good chunk of it in 125,000 years. I think we're gonna. The interesting thing about the UAE is it gives so much away in its current landscape, if you know what I mean, because there's a character of the cities and a character of the people in those cities. So I actually think I think the UAE is well placed to and must do anyway is move on to new tech and high tech and everything else. So I actually think it'll be a pretty interesting history. I think there'll be more big cities. Obviously, there have to be to populate people. But I think, the way I see cities being built, there's always innovation in there. And I would love to see, I'd love to see gardens that go between buildings, which people have talked about, which we have to do in cities and things like that. And energy, how does energy come from the city? How does it go from the city? How all cities generate their own energy. But I think it would be interesting. It is a fun one, and it sort of spars the mind. It's a bit like Jules Verne. Even now, if you read Jules Verne, there's something in there that surprises you. And actually, once I got some CGI and actually started to develop the worlds of Jules Verne, and you got a very futuristic thing still. So, and I hope we've got cars that will be in the air, not on the ground anymore, or if not, something equivalent. I think it'll be a fun period, and I think that the UAE's got challenges ahead, but I think it's, as I say, it's got this spirit of evolution about it, that it goes on to new things. It's very well placed, obviously strategically. So, it'll be, I'll have to hang around, I think, for that one.
Yeah, Alma, you have any thoughts? What would you imagination produce in 100 years? What do you think the trajectory is?
I pretty much agree with Anthony, but gosh, it's a question I really need to think about, but I guess multiple streams will be available. I think that there's going to be a lot more content to capture. And like Anthony mentioned, we might be filming, flying cars, or it's just crazy. So, this is really, I don't know if this is relevant, but when you mentioned that, a cartoon came in mind, which I used to watch when I was a kid, and it was about the future, and it was called The Jetsons. And I remember Anthony mentioned the flying cars, and it just came in mind. But I guess, yeah, we'll have to wait and see.
There is one interesting thing that, sorry, I didn't mean to cut off there.
No, go ahead.
Thing that sort of has been thrown up. I mean, since the COVID, I think that UAE has had to consider how does it not import a lot of things like vegetables and other things. And what's amazing to me is that in that time they've expanded, different kinds of agriculture right in the middle of the desert, which is incredible. And I think actually there are a lot more secrets in the desert that you can use. You don't have to just have it as sand. You can generate power from all sorts of other ways and things. So I think that could be a very interesting area. How once they populate the desert with these cities, but maybe they're going back in a different way to populate the deserts in a different way. And I think I can see vegetables being grown in a desert, because in a way you have to be self-sustainable today,
Yeah, in fact, you
last
an innovator there.
pandemic. Sorry.
No, go ahead. No, the UAE is innovative in that direction with this, what we call the food, energy, water nexus, and in terms of sustainable development. Laura mentioned that so that these cities don't become dry cities, not in the sense of that we often think of in that term, but dry in the sense of no water, no food, and no sustainability. They're really leading in vertical farming, micro irrigation, hydroponics. The Emirates Biofarm, for example, grows fruits and vegetables in red sand, as it's called sweet sand. It's actually, it's arable in that sense. Hello, Kitty. And so I think that the next 100 years will be how the UAE sets a model for sustainability going forward, so that it doesn't end up being a dystopian desert, as Aaron pointed out before.
Sorry, Jonathan, one last thought here. There is a metaphor in the phalange in a way, isn't there? This is a mechanism which could be modern, and yet it irrigates the desert. When you look at it, it's incredibly sophisticated and clever how it operates, and how that technology we've got to think about and take back to the desert in a different way. And this is why I keep saying there are keys. That's why this history is important. There are keys in the past and the things that Emiratis have done, or their forefathers have done, which they need to re-unlock. And that's a big challenge in the next 100 years.
Thank you. Nasser, do you have some comments on this? I know your research deals with some of these same issues and questions.
Yes, my research mostly focuses on food and water security in the region and sustainable practices that may allow the country to remain food secure and water secure. And it kind of comes from the rejection of the notion that the desert is simply a dead place. It is an ecosystem in itself, a rich and diverse ecosystem. And it's really important to leverage the environment to your advantage. And as Anthony mentioned, it is unlocking and continuing to unlock these certain advantages. And you could see it since, well, whether it's during the Bronze Age when bronze was there, or it's the pearl. And I think the future has to do with unlocking the desert again and trying to get that leverage and advantage again. And that has to do with soil sciences, vertical farming, and whatever that may promote food and water security in this regard. So yeah, it's mostly the rejection of the notion that it's simply a dead ecosystem, and you should actually make do with whatever you have, whether it's as the titles of the first two episodes highlight, or it's simply just unlocking and dominating whatever you have in the given time, I would say.
Interesting perspective. You know, we're now in the month of November, which is No Waste November. We know that 30% of all food is wasted, much of it in production, but also in consumption. I'd like to ask you, Nasser, amongst your peer group, students and family and friends, how seriously do they take the question of sustainable development and food waste, for example, or ecological living? Because again, one of the stereotypes is that the UAE is all about your big Nissan Patrol and coffee and conspicuous consumption, which can be about. There's maybe there's nothing wrong with that. But on the flip side of that, is there a greater awareness of the ethical dimensions of consumption and how people need to make different choices?
I think the discourse is starting right now, and I really believe that it should start. It's about time. Specifically because if you see food waste, the UAE is leading in that. It is #1 per capita, and that is a very worrisome statistic. So you would want to increase awareness, but it's about lifestyle. It's not only about awareness. You would have to introduce a lot of things, or I wouldn't say introduce a lot of things. I would say reintroduce, because if you would look at our ancestors and how they would kind of deal with waste management or even food waste. They would, for example, have dried seafood with dried fish called malih or sahna, and that would increase shelf life. And when you have that, wasting food is not as it can mitigate those the negative outcomes of wasting food. So I guess it's reintroducing some stuff that were part of our culture and still is, but just making it more of a norm, making it the mainstream, I would say.
Excellent. Thank you for those comments. You seem hopeful that there's a little bit of a shift in local culture and people are taking this more seriously. I know on the campus of New York University, there's a strong movement for sustainability and to end food waste, or to limit it at least. I'm wondering about the question of water as well. And if, Eric, you might talk a little bit more about water and maritime resources and what some of the challenges are today for the UAE and also some of the prospects going forward in terms of, again, picking up on Rashid's excellent question about the next 100 years and what sorts of histories and stories we'll be writing the next 100 years. Optimistic or perhaps less optimistic ones. Any thoughts?
Well, that's why I'm a historian, is fortunately I don't have to predict. It's sort of, it is, I would say, rather tricky. I do say, unfortunately, I mean, this is globally, this is not just UAE, but I am unfortunately rather pessimistic. You know, you've seen sort of a global reduction in fish stocks of anywhere from 80 to 90%, depending on where you look. And that is no exception within the Gulf. You see coral bleaching, which is happening around the world as well as in the UAE. And so you see, I guess we would call it a host of environmental challenges that are currently facing most industries that are involved with marine resources in general. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't opportunities and that there aren't quite a bit of technologies and innovative ways of fish farming and all the rest of it to combat that. But as a whole, I think the beginnings of climate change are only just beginning to be felt in the marine environment. Particularly if you look at current estimations of the global rise in 2 degrees at the minimum, more likely to 3 to 4. You're talking about, I guess, what you would call a much more drastically challenging marine environment in general. So I will end on that very unfortunately happy note. Yes.
A happy note. Laura, do you have a happy note or a less happy note about urban living in the UAE in the next generation or two?
No, just to say that I think Nasser is right, and these are questions that are rising now and that are rising a lot. And I think a lot of the youth is actually highly aware of these issues and is starting to really ask these difficult questions and hopeful questions.
That's great, wonderful. We're almost running out of time. We've got time for maybe another question or two or comment. I'm just wondering, perhaps Anthony and Alma, you can speak to current projects and any projects you might have, you're being brainstorming about dealing with UAE and its history or heritage so that our viewers might have something to anticipate in the years to come, or other resources they might make use of today, since many of the questions had to do with UAE heritage and how this might be something that would trigger more storytelling and more research, documentary and historical and others. Thoughts, Alma?
Yeah, so in terms of storytelling, we are an upcoming project. We are venturing into the world of animation and looking at storytelling through comics. And that is to tap into the youth sector. So there's a lot of exciting projects in that field. So that's a new venture we're looking into.
Thank you. Anthony, any thoughts?
Yeah, we have a couple of things we may collaborate on with Image Nation, which are under discussion, which would be again trying to bring history back, specific history back. We are just finishing a actually really interesting film, which is about the 10 years of NYU. And what's interesting is we've taken it from the broad perspective of telling it through the people who've been at university, but it really does show to me, one of the reasons I was amazed by the university when I first went there, the diversity of the people in the university, the culture of the university, and the impact that university has broadly. So that's an exciting project which we'll finish fairly soon. But then further afield, we've just come back from diving on a massive project involving NASA and all sorts of other people, the 5 deepest points of the world's oceans. And actually it couldn't be a more relevant time to do it because we broke the record, Jim Cameron's record of going to the deepest point of the Mariana Trench, but we found in each ocean sources, material, fish, new organisms that actually are the future of this planet in my view. So that's a huge 5-part series which will come out next year. A lot of new stuff in it, and it needed masses of new technology. Imagine filming at 11,000 meters underwater. as an offshoot of that project, we also visited the Titanic for the first time. It's always been a passion of mine to go to the Titanic. No one's been there for 15 years. We've just returned from the Titanic. That's pretty special because it's really about the people. When you get down there, you realize it's the people's lives are there all over the wreck. Extraordinary. And then we have a feature film coming on, you probably all know Professor Hawking, one of the great scientists. And I was lucky enough to work with him for 2 years on this project, which is really his vision and what happened to him in his life, with his archives, with his family, with other scientists. And what turns out in this 90-minute film is an absolutely extraordinary film that I think will make most people cry and laugh at the same time, because he's an extraordinary figure. And we continued making that during lockdown. So I think that'll be powerful. But then we have some very powerful immersive projects coming, which are really exciting. We're working with Apple and other big organizations, but one of the big ones I want to mention is, how do you take something and tell a story about it immersively in the next generation of things? Well, we've partnered, funnily enough, with the Chinese government and the Chinese surgeons, and we've gone inside and we've scanned women's bodies at every stage of pregnancy, and you put your whatever it is, your VR headset on, and you can walk through what happens at every stage. Why is this important? Because a large percentage of Chinese women are illiterate and can't understand what doctors are telling them. Here they can live and understand their bodies. Now that, to me, is new technology telling a story which is going to change China in its whole birth system. At the same time, we produce hearts and other things that their surgeons can now operate, seeing out of the corner of a pair of glasses a body part which makes it safer. But back to Professor Hawking, we've also designed with him before he died a version of location-based VR where you will be able to put a visor on, and you will go off into the universe with Hawking, who's back to life, who's been scanned as with you, into the planets. How accurate is that? Well, 2 years after he died, 2 planets were found. And when they went back and analyzed them against what we had built with him in a computer graphics world, they were totally and utterly accurate. The color, the texture, and everything else. So that's exciting. That's a bit traveling through somebody's mind. So,
wow, fabulous.
We've got great projects in one level, and I can't wait to start talking again to the graduates and undergraduates at the university, because we've been doing this for the last 2 years in courses. Well, it's coming, and the most exciting thing, and I'll shut up then when I say that, but is just a simple pair of glasses where AR and MR come into play, and all of us can start to experience things together in the room, a Shakespeare production on the table, or anything we like. We could be in a fish tank and have sharks coming at us in our own rooms. We're about to enter a new era, but how exciting that is for Eric and all the other experts here, and Erin, because we can bring their worlds back to life in groups, in front of you, boats or whatever you want, so you can interact with it. And that is the new frontier. Forget smartphones. Smartphones are gone. They've happened. The new frontier is a pair of headset or a pair of glasses where you're interacting with that world, and it's seeing how you're reacting with that world. And there's no other medium that does that. So that, to me, in a COVID environment, is a really exciting prospect where we can get on and start to communicate, and people can communicate wherever they are. A kid can go into the Great Pyramid and Visa. This, to me, is an exciting future. Absolutely exciting.
It's the technology that makes this so exciting. I think maybe you could leave the shark part out of it. Maybe that's just me. But it's the stories that the technology allows you to tell that are so compelling. They get people engaged. And as the documentary series that we all witnessed and have been discussing tonight shows, this has been a really extraordinary use of technology for immersive storytelling, to immerse us into stories of the UAE. They're not the only stories that can be told, of course. There are multiple stories, but it's my sincere hope that our discussion tonight, as well as the actual films themselves, will trigger further discussions, more research, student projects, family oral history gatherings to talk about their own histories. I know this is already going on in various parts of the UAE. I just want to end, as we're out of time tonight, by thanking all of our participants, certainly Professors Erin Pettigrew, Laura Asaf, and Eric Staples from here. Thank you to our great student, Nasser Anwahi. And thank you to the wonderful partners who put this all together for us, Alma Al-Mubarak from Imagination, of course, Anthony Geffen, the celebrated filmmaker and storyteller, and NYUAD faculty member. I'll put that in at the end. Thank you to everybody, and thank you to our participants for your wonderful questions in the Q&A. And if you have not seen all the episodes, please go to historyoftheemirates.com and you can watch them, as well as explore that website, which has some wonderful things like 7 mysteries of the Emirates. What are those 7 mysteries? Look it up. And we'll see you at the next panel. Thank you again for your participation.